So thank you. Good morning. Nice to see you all. Thanks for your time. We're going to just briefly go through the intro deck, and then the main plan for this session is to have a Q&A on what you've read so far and been digesting. So the intention was to give you, unlike round one, to give you more time to look at the stuff and start planning out how you think you're going to answer some of these questions. And that might make for a better Q&A. That was the intention this time round. So just very briefly, if we go through the slides, Joe, on the first slide really. So getting to the point, the plan as it is so far. So we put out a pretty general, relatively ambiguous plan in round one in terms of some of the specific topics that we know are very important to landing the actual dates and plans. But round two was always going to be something which at least contained dates and a bit more specificity, and we progressed some of the assumptions in some of the areas, particularly around SIT and how we might run SIT, and we are aligning to a more certain approach to migration as we go through this process. The bit that is probably less progressed is qualification, and we can talk about these subjects as we go through. But the intention was to be a bit more certain about some of these things and to be a bit more specific in terms of the plan and the dates and so on, and starting to put a timeline together, which, as I say, was an illustrative timeline. I think we made clear in the documents that it was supposed to be a good basis upon which to provoke the kind of questions and responses and evidence, either to support that illustrative timeline or not. And a further timeline, which you'll have seen, which we call the challenge timeline, which I'm sure we'll get to discussing at some point in this session. So we believe we progressed it to some extent in round two. We're not at the end of the process yet, and there's still some areas of uncertainty that need some further work, as we knew would be the case. So that's where we kind of set things up. On the next slide, Joe, the outcome really of round two. So what we want to do is to identify, the best or better approaches and assumptions. We think we've been clearer in the RAID document about the assumptions and the approach that we're taking, and we think we've been much clearer on the durations due to the dates in the plan as well. But the outcome of round two needs to be, I guess, collectively felt to be sufficiently progressing the process in order to go into round three. And there'll definitely be a point at which we will have to consider what we've got back in round two and see where the process is in terms of the plan. And there'll have to be some form of governance scrutiny on the outcomes and the outputs of round two before we just rush into round three willy-nilly, if you like. And that's something else we can talk about in the session if you wish. But the way we've framed this is, let's do round two, let's see where we're at, let's see what we've got back, let's see what it's telling us, and then we need to align the senior stakeholders to where we think we are in the process. The approach has always been for the plan that we need to get there as quickly as possible, because we want a new baseline plan and one we all want to buy into as credible and realistic, but we don't want to rush it so much that it's not credible and not sound and not solid. So there is a balance to be struck, and we won't really know where we are until we get to the end of round two. So we've been very clear about the outcomes being sufficient to allow movement into a final round three consultation, which ultimately should be a kick the tires on something that's relatively clear at that stage. So once we've iterated at the end of round two, we should have something that's reasonably solid and is a basis for kicking the tires in round three. Next slide. Okay, so what did we do? We provided the planning documents, we provided the Microsoft project plan, as we said we would. We provided dates this time. We were clear about some of the approaches and uncertainties that we had in round one. And we also outlined via an additional plan on page a more challenging timeline that we wished you to consider. Now, this isn't underpinned by any plan. This is based on some fairly high level logic and rationale that suggests that some elements of this timeline and the approach articulated in that timeline may be worthy of consideration and may be worthy to, if you like, enliven the debate about how we get closer or as close as possible to the transition timeline that Ofgem laid out. So it's always been clearly set by Ofgem as the sponsor that they expect people to deliver to the timetable or as close as possible to the timetable with the supporting evidence as to why the timetable can't be met. And that's obviously something consistent we want to do. However, the challenge timeline isn't the timetable. It is later than the timetable, but obviously a lot earlier than the illustrative timeline and the planning documents that we laid out. And the reason for that timeline is purely to put some pressure on all of us to challenge ourselves and each other about how quickly we can deliver the programme. And we'll cover this in more detail when we get into the Q&A, but the intention of that was purely that. We're not saying at this stage that this is a something that's underpinned by all the planning, thinking and information that demonstrates that timeline is realistic or achievable, but it is to provoke the thinking at this stage and only to do that at this stage. So we provided a set of consultation questions. We simplified the questions. We reduced the number of questions considerably this time because we wanted to focus your time on the answers and providing more specific information by way of answers. And obviously we are asking for your help because, as you know, we're trying to work with you. We're trying to go into bat on your behalf with senior stakeholders to try to reach something which we all believe is realistic and achievable, including ourselves. The challenge timeline is as challenging for you as it is for us, and whether we have views on whether it's realistic and deliverable, that's something to be discussed at another time, because at this stage we are all being challenged by that challenge timeline. We're all thinking about how we could respond to that with an open mind, without kind of prejudging it. So, you know, we are also, if you like, providing thinking and evidence to this process as we go through round 2. So the important point here is that we are working on your behalf. We want to work with you to come up with a realistic plan, but we do need your help. We do need your information. We do need your input. We recognise that each party is at different stages in their journey towards the M3 demonstration of readiness to go into DBT. Every participant will be producing and developing high-level plans for that, and may not be in a mature state at this stage in the game. We recognise that there is that challenge, but we're just asking for people to honestly provide the best information they have. And if they don't have all of the plans landed at this stage, then they're calling out the assumptions they're making or the uncertainties that they have, so that we at least know what you've got and why you've got it, and what you don't have and why you don't have it at this stage. We want that transparency and understanding of where you are and your individual thinking by way of your consultation responses about where you are, what your thinking is, and nothing will be perfect. We're not expecting perfect responses, but we are expecting some evidence, and some particularly evidence based on the planning that you're doing. Even if you don't have final plans, you may have draft plans, or you may have planning work you've done that has provided information and evidence in relation to, you know, estimating durations or assumptions you've made about the approach where you think we've not been clear enough. That's the, you know, we've given you an imperfect plan with uncertainties in it, and we are expecting that you will reply with a certain amount of statement of the uncertainty, but more importantly, what you're doing about that, and how you're estimating, and what approaches you're assuming, and the best information you have about timelines, so that we can have a grown-up planning, estimating, planning progression conversation as we go through at the end of round 2 and in towards round 3. So again, I think we've been clear about that, but we do at this stage need you to step up with the best thinking and information that you have, so that we can see where we are at the end of this point. And that's why we've truncated round 2 to 3 weeks, because we wanted more time to, if you like, consider what you sent back. We're expecting more information back from more parties this time. We wanted to be tooled up to kind of absorb that information and start to work with all stakeholders to understand where we're at, and that includes yourselves as well as Ofgem, the IPA, and other stakeholders that will want to understand where we're at. And as you know, we have invited IPA and Ofgem to every playback session, and they're part of the team. that needs to come up with a good result. We don't see this as an us and them. We see this as a collaboration across all parties. We want Ofgem to understand the challenges and the realities of delivering this programme, but we also want to be demonstrating that we're doing our best to deliver this as early as possible, given the, if you like, the political and regulatory pressures on net zero initiatives at this point, which I think we can all understand. So that's where we are at the moment. Then slide 5 is the next one. So we did give some guidance on evidence. We had a good think about where the evidence should be, but primarily it's where you've got to in your delivery planning process, plans that you have, or thinking based on the plans that you're doing at the moment, with estimates for activities and any assumptions that you have, or challenges you have on assumptions we've made that you don't think are realistic or reasonable or not that well informed. So all of those things, you know, we've given you plenty of information to come back on at us with, and we're quite happy to be challenged on the assumptions and the kind of approaches that we've laid out, and hopefully this session will help us discuss those. The final 2 slides are just the timelines, I think, which are, I think I've already described. There is the illustrative timeline with all the planning documents, which is the best effort to try to progress towards a realistic delivery timeline. And then the final challenge timeline, which is to try to come up with something that might be easier for, if you like, Ofgem to recognise and accept, but may not be realistic or achievable. And we can't tell you that it is because we haven't done the planning work behind it. We have thinking and logic and rationale behind it, but there is a certain amount of significant risk in relation to this timeline. There's no contingency in it, so therefore the risks are greater. Some of the assumptions and approaches are arguable, but it is, as I say, it is what it is, and it's a device to try to enrich the conversation about how we reach an agreeable timeline. And the number of data points we now have, we have a timetable, which we know the programme has slipped against initially by 6 months due to the design. So we have the timetable, which Ofgem said themselves, and Rachel said at the open day, she accepted that there were going to be delays to milestones and that things would have to come back to Ofgem because, in brackets, milestones would be delayed more than 3 months in some cases. So there was an acknowledgement by Ofgem that the timetable wasn't realistic and achievable in saying that. But we need to understand what the broad range of dates might be, and we may end up with a plan that has a range of dates, a range of go-live dates, and so on. So putting a range of PoaPs in there, or a couple of boundary points on the PoaPs, is helpful to get the thinking about how we might construct a range of dates. That's really it. So I'm going to shut up now because I think it's more that you want to get under the skin of this, and we want this to be a Q&A session. So for the next 45 minutes, we're kind of, I'm here, Kate's here, Jason's here, and so on. So we're here to answer your questions and try to help you kind of make sense of what it is you need to reply on by the end of next week. So over to you, hands up, or the normal way we do it, I think, is hands up, and we just take hands as they come.
Thanks, Keith. I'll fill the void until you got a first hand, so shut up. That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Morning all.
Good morning.
It's, again, as always with me, quite a basic question, but yes. What are the highest level? What are the planning assumptions on the non-SIP path to get through to migration? Because there's so much overlap between the bars on both of the plans, and there's no assumptions been provided that just takes you through that end-to-end journey. So, for example, you get through your DBT. At high level, are you assuming 3 months for qualification testing, and then how long for end-to-end testing? Do you see what I mean? So there's no linear pathway through that.
Put the illustration PoaP up, Joe, because it might be helpful to see the picture.
Yeah, and then maybe I can talk through it a bit. I think, Neil, the answer is, you know, there's a fair bit of flexibility in there, but let's get it on the screen and then talk through it.
Yeah, bear with me. I'm just pulling it up.
So yeah, I understand this flexibility, but it's just more, what is the basic assumption behind getting you through to that end-to-end plan.
So we used to talking about the qualification route, the non-sit route.
Yes, I think at this stage that is our assumption, that we'll be non-sit, on the basis that we haven't got any evidence that suggests that we can achieve any of the sit timescales at this point in time. But yeah, it's very difficult to really. So, for example, for end-to-end testing ahead of migration, what is the basic assumption to get you through to the start of migration?
But by the way, just to pick you up on, you said that you don't have evidence to support that you could go and sit. We will need you to provide evidence why you can't do sits. So the kind of negative needs to be informed and proved by your response, because it will help us understand why parties can't do sits. So if you don't have evidence to support you can you provide evidence that suggests why you can't? That's really important for us in terms of consultation responses, to kind of prove the negatives as well as the positives, support the positives. That evidence is very helpful to us in, if you like, challenging the assumptions that we may have made. Sorry, Kate, I'll shut up there.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
That's fine as well, yeah, Keith.
Thank you.
Understand.
Sorry, Nick. Joe, can you go to the high level PoaP? I think that probably illustrates it better. It's easier to talk to. Can you make that bigger at all? That's probably, yeah. And then go down a wee bit, because we're talking about the non-sit route.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think, gosh, sorry, I'm struggling with my little screen, but it's all right, leave it there. So I think, at the front end, we've got the same assumptions as for everybody else, that you've got, you're doing your impact assessment, you're doing your planning, you're finishing off procurement and all that sort of stuff. And then what we've allowed for is, a fairly longish period of DBT activities. And we've been, one of the things that we've said, obviously has to start reasonably soon, is the qualification, the procedural part of the qualification. So if you think of qualification as being the procedural bit and a testing bit, the procedural bit, the sooner we can get started on that, the better. So that will overlap. And then really it's, we've got 4 sort of example arrows down into qualification, in terms of, we're assuming that we're going to be using tranches. I'm sure we will. Quite how we constitute those tranches, we don't yet know. That's something that we're working on. But, you drop into qualification there. And then the idea is that the fastest people to finish will be, I can't remember exactly what that period is before you get into sandbox, but I think we're assuming sort of 3 months. And then you can do sandbox, and then basically once you're qualified and you've done whatever testing you feel is necessary in the sandbox, and you've gone live with your system, then you can start migration. So, it's kind of, obviously it's got to be after the milestones M12, M13, but as soon as, so I think the answer would be that if you get into qualification relatively early, you've then got 3 to 6 months in sandbox, and then you can go live and you can start migrating.
There's one dependency just to highlight in there as well, Kate, is we have assumed that qualification can begin before the end of sit, and once we've got the majority of sit executed, so we have some certainty around the robustness of the central arrangements to start qualification. So that's why qualification starts when it does, and it doesn't start earlier, and it doesn't start after the end of sit execution. We've assumed some overlap with sit, but we have assumed that we cannot start qualification until we've got some confidence in particularly, the functional robustness of of the arrangements to come out of SIT. So I just wanted to highlight that as well, Kate.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And the overlap is, it's not just a sort of a point in SIT. It's
Sorry,
when
you've
we
gone
finish
quiet,
SIT.
Kate.
Oh, sorry, it's when we've finished SIT functional. So the operational bit of SIT, we don't mind that overlapping with qualification as long as we've done SIT functional. That's the essential thing. So that's the point where we think that qualification can reasonably start.
Okay,
Does
so
that all make sense?
yes. So just working that through then. So you can start migration without any dependency on any end-to-end testing going ahead. So you're making that assumption on the non-SIT path because they're starting at the same time. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the idea about the end-to-end sandbox is it's there, you know, I don't know if you did the smart metering program, but it's very like the idea in smart metering that you've got essential testing that you have to do, which in smart metering was the UEPT, and in here obviously it's qualification. And then after that, you've got an environment on which you can test your business processes, your changes in more detail, and so on and so forth. And, you know, in smart metering, this was, you know, Adam will, I'm sure, will stand up and back me up on this. You know, this was a really, really valuable piece of the testing. It wasn't mandatory, but people made use of it, and people made good use of it, and really important things were uncovered in it. And so, you know, we're saying, okay, guys, here's, you know, we're going to provide, if you like, a testing service, and then it's over to you. Now, you know, I think everybody on this call will make really good use of that opportunity. I think some of the small suppliers will do very little, but you know, for you guys, I think it's a really, really important part of the picture, even though it's not mandatory, to allow you a good sort of 6 months to bash things round and really test your own systems.
Can I just add to that, just to look at the firm dependencies? So you can't start migration until you've qualified, right? Yep. So the green arrow at the bottom, it allow that qualification will have an element of testing that you will need to do. It will have an element of assurance around your back office system testing. So that will be expected to be done during qualification. And then, as Kate says, you'll have that end-to-end sandbox facility available for you to use as you please. But you will have done something similar to our SIT testing as part of your qualification process, and will also be assuring some of your back office testing as part of qualification as well. So you won't be able to start migration until you've qualified. It's a bit of an obvious statement, and there is testing and assurance activities as part of that qualification. And we've allowed basically a month after the end of qualification test execution to wrap up all the governance and the PAB decision making process in the 3 codes that are going to be affected.
Okay, right. Yep. So I wasn't I wasn't necessarily aware there wasn't any expectation on the end-to-end testing, so appreciate that. Have you, and are there any basic assumptions around how long the qualification SAD process is likely to take? Well,
so we've done, you know, we've obviously talked to the BSc a fair bit. We've talked to various suppliers and agents and so on, and I think it varies a lot. I mean, the basic expectation is that it would take around 6 months, I think. But really, you know, that is something that we want the BSc, obviously the other code bodies are involved as well, but principally it's on the BSc, as you all appreciate. We really want the BSc to kind of own this, because after all, it's they who are going to be running this. You know, the SAD process will be the SAD process as it is, with some amendments for the new functionality. So it's not going to be, you know, it's not going to be ripping it up and writing something new. It's likely to be that what you already see, but allowing for the fact that you've now got data services, that you've got changes to your back back office systems and all that sort of thing. So we've just allowed a long time period, because even if we say 6 months, you know, obviously it's going to be something that everybody's going through. So the BSc is going to have to staff up accordingly, but it will be helpful to them if we can get people starting to go through it as soon as possible, so that we smooth out the load on them, really. Just one other thing, sorry, Neil, while I'm looking at this, and this is not terribly helpful, and maybe we should change this, but the green line that goes through the bars on the bottom doesn't show going through end-to-end sandbox, and I think, you know, a sort of a normal path through, maybe what we should represent is that it comes down from qualification into sandbox, goes along sandbox, and then goes down to live. I think that's a more representative path, and maybe that's some of the difficulty behind your questions, that it doesn't represent it terribly well.
Yeah, I think so, and it's just some of the real basic assumptions. So like when you mention dependencies, so when you mention the 6 months of SAD qualification, I'm assuming then that has to be completed before you go into the migration, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then looking at the migration, then yeah, so effectively the migration 9 months start would mean that really, if you're going for the non-SIT route, you can't, there won't really be any opportunity to do any end-to-end testing to achieve that timescale. Do you see what I mean? So I'm just trying to piece some of these pieces of the puzzle together and see if it actually hangs together at the highest level.
So I think if you look at this and you say, okay, so we're not going to do SIT, but we go into qualification as soon as it's open in the first tranche, say, because let's say, for the sake of argument, I don't know if this will be the case, that large suppliers go first, no idea, but just let's say that. So, and then you've done your SAD, or at least you've started your SAD earlier than that, so that it concludes, say, at roughly 3 months into the qualification execution. You spend 3 months doing your qualification testing, at which point you can drop into the end-to-end sandbox pretty much at the beginning of the purple bar there, the 11-month bar, and you've got a 6 month period to tidy up anything to do with qualification and go live, and then start your migration at the very beginning.
Right, okay, because the end-to-end sandbox is dependent upon SIT completion, not qualification. Is that what we're saying? For you, if you're going the non-SIT route, you have to qualify. In other words, you have to execute your qualification tests and complete your SAD. Well, actually, that's a good point. So do you need to, yeah, I was going to say, and complete the SAD before you go into end-to-end sandbox. But that's a really good point, and I shall note that down. You certainly have to complete the qualification test. Yep.
But that's okay. So I'm just scribbling that down as to think about. Need to qualify, need to SAD before a sandbox. I'm guessing that we will say no, you don't have to finish the SAD before the sandbox. That's
the assumption in here, Kate. It is. Okay. Yeah. So the SAD is the last part that you take to the PAB to get it signed off effectively, and the test evidence is part of that final PAB approval that you're qualified before dropping into migration.
And sandbox isn't mandatory anyway, but we're assuming that you want to do some of that.
I mean, maybe what will help is if we, rather than just trying to show critical path, if we show a sort of a typical path through, that might be helpful.
Maybe we show a tranche 1 participant case or something like that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I would say, Arch, is that the 12 months of qualification execution, we have asked Elexon, BSc and Repco to review as to whether that is a suitable period, because at this point we haven't got any evidence to change the assumption that 12 months was enough for qualification execution that sat in the Ofgem transition timetable. So we haven't arbitrarily changed that 12 months. We're waiting to see some feedback from the qualification bodies to see if that 12-month period is still reasonable, given the number of agents they're expecting to come through and the profile of their resourcing and the amount of testing they may expect and things like that. So that's why that 12 months hasn't changed in the plan as well, because we have no evidence to change it yet, although we are asking.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That was one of our questions, to be honest. But I think ultimately, yeah, if you think about a basic pathway through this, so say if it was tranche one, I do think that certainly personally that would help me try and piece some of the high level dependencies together, and then okay, so what are the expectations? Because again, at the highest level, if you're in a tranche 3, then just looking at this high level plan on a page, and you're left with only a couple of months to complete migration. Do you see what I mean? Because that will have, because you'll have back-ended it all rather than the 9 months.
Yeah.
That is the implication of this plan, is that participants in the last tranche that goes through have less time to migrate at the back end.
Yeah. And again, that will probably slant the way that we do the tranching, which may push us to saying, okay, large suppliers with large communities to migrate, you go in early tranches, because then you've got longer to do your migration. I'm just, saying that's an example. I'm not saying that's the way it will be, but I can imagine that might happen.
I think the other thing I'd say, Kate, we haven't spoken about this. We probably need the feedback from Elexon and Retco to show the timescales for that sort of first tranche participants, because we're thinking broadly 6 months, Neil. But if I'm going to be honest, that we haven't got that challenge back from the qualification bodies yet. So it's a broad assumption underneath this at the moment. But we need to understand a little more back from the qualification bodies as to how that might work in that 12-month band, or whether that 12-month band needs to change.
Yeah, understood, because those are some of the assumptions that we'd like to see, really. But I guess so I'm almost expecting them from yourselves, but it sounds like you need them from the other parties anyway. So
yes,
okay,
it's an important distinction that the programme is not responsible for the execution of qualification. The responsibility sits with the qualification bodies. So that's not a programme managed element, although obviously we have to make assumptions in our plan as to how long it's going to take the qualification bodies to do it.
Okay, thank you. I'll shut up now.
So that's option, right? So you need to do something to get some of the options.
Chris, I think you've got your...
Okay, yeah, just a quick question. Hopefully, should be pretty easy to answer. The line that says "other sit," don't understand that, because I kind of assumed it was a central systems, but then you've got central systems above. Can you just tell us who other sit might be?
So the sort of the idea underpinning this is that we will take people into sit who are ready for sit and declare their intention to go into sit, and we will do our component integration and get everything all put together and all working and set people going. And one of the early things that we'll do is we'll look at how people are progressing, because I think it's a learning that came across certainly from faster switching, that where you're dependent on other participants in a test stage. So, for example, in faster switching UEPT, people were paired up, or rather there were groups of 3 and people were testing between them and so on. If you're trying to go fast and one of your partners has got issues for whatever reason, then you get very held up. So what we wanted to try to do was see how things are going, and then at a certain point review how things are working, and say, okay, this supplier's really racing through, this data service is really also racing through, we're going to test via that pathway. And this is what we're talking about, the sort of the minimum viable cohort, that we're going to have that would be the people who are in SIT who are going through it fastest. And so what we'd be saying is that we would be, because SIT is all about proving the end-to-end solution, it's not about proving that your system is capable. I mean, that's a kind of a byproduct of it, but the main purpose is the end-to-end solution works as designed, etc., etc. And so, you know, SIT effectively will have achieved its purpose when that fast stream, if you like, the minimum viable cohort, has actually got through all of the testing. Now, what we've said on this plan, and it's a bit different on the other one, but on this plan, we will obviously, you know, the other entrants in SIT who weren't put in the, if you like, put in the fastest category because they were going through things a little bit more slowly, they carry on. But what we're trying to do with this is trying to get to a point where we get, so the people who are racing through SIT and have got everything sorted, to allow them to get to a point where they can go live as early as possible. So that's the difference between the first. Yeah, we should have, sorry, I'm seeing all these things now looking at it. We should have color coded this better. So we should have done the minimum viable cohort, and then we should have had other SIT participants in a slightly different color from the non-SIT and so on. But so it's really that 1, 2, 3, 4. So the top, forget the migration swim lane, the top 4 swim lanes are all SIT. But the idea is that, you know, we'll identify this fast moving stream and get that done as fast as possible and leave the others to carry on and, you know, and catch up or whatever.
So there is a middle ground there then in that case, because I think before there'd been a like you're either in SIT or you're not in SIT. It sounds like now you could be in that middle stream that says we're not ready for MVP SIT, but we are ready for, you know, later stream SIT. We're not in the we don't want to do SIT element.
So we haven't quite pitched it like that. What we've said is that we will allow some flex on the date for entry into SIT, because what we were thinking initially was, okay, everybody gets ready, it's this date. If you don't make it for SIT on this date, sorry guys, you're out. Even if you've been trying hard, you may have hit a last minute glitch, whatever. So we'll give a certain amount of flex, and I think we said on this, Keith, correct me if I'm wrong, that we'd have like a month's flex. Sorry, I'm just back from holiday, so some of this is kind of thinking, oh my God, what did we say? Months. So we said we'd have a month's flex at the beginning. So it's not exactly come into SIT where you want, but it's a bit of flex, and then it's trying to make sure that those who go fastest can go as fast as they possibly can, if you see what I mean. And the others who can't quite go as fast as that can still take advantage of SIT, but not necessarily at the fastest pace.
And the differentiation, I guess, was that we need SIT to be done for the programme's purpose to prove the end-to-end solution works, as Kate said. But we recognise some participants would like to do SIT for their own purposes, and we wanted to try to accommodate both elements in this.
And to add to that, again, to reiterate the point from earlier, once we finish functional SIT, then that's the trigger for the start of qualification. So the sooner we do that, the sooner the rest of the parties who are longer with their DBT can start the qualification process.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
So
I get it.
It's trying to do this. It's again, you know, trying to move at the pace of the fastest for those who want to move through, Chris, as we've always tried to do. And this is a slightly different approach to try and facilitate that, and also to try and get qualification started a bit earlier as well for those who are going to take a bit longer.
Yeah. I mean, what would be really nice is to get your opinions on that as an approach, because that's, you know, that's something that obviously we put a bit of thought into, you know, before producing this, and that seemed to us to be a, you know, way that we thought would work of doing things. So any you know, Chris or anybody else got any particular comments on that?
I mean, my outlook is it's a good thing, because we're very early on in the planning stages at the moment, and participants might say that they want to be in SIT and that might be their real driver at the moment to be in SIT, but the timelines for that might be problematic later down the line in 6 months' time or 9 months' time. So I think in order, to mitigate that and to make sure that you've got people going through at different speeds and that you don't get into a kind of resource bottleneck on qualification, I think it's a good thing. It allows some kind of leeway, doesn't it? So
I think it's important to kind of reference the challenge timeline, where the approach to SIT and the thinking around SIT is more extreme or more black and white, so that in that particular case on the challenge timeline, we're saying that those that get through the DBT more quickly and are ready for SIT more quickly, assuming the central parties are all ready, it would allow us to start SIT earlier, but it would mean that those that weren't ready would not be in SIT. So it's a more radical, more strongly incentivized for people to get through DBT and get to SIT, but those that don't achieve that quickly won't be in SIT and they'll have to go the other route. And it's important that when you look at your responses and your thoughts on our thinking, on our approach, that you look at both of those, because that might be a legitimate approach for any plan we come up with. And therefore there may be thinking on approach in the challenge timeline that might be suitable for any baseline plan we come up with. So therefore actually showing the two different ideas about how we get to SIT and how we get through SIT. There are two ideas there, one in this timeline, one in the challenge timeline, and we would like to get your views on both of them, because clearly it's important, if we want to try to get the earliest delivery of this programme, is to strongly get through and quickly get through DBT and quickly get into SIT and quickly get through SIT. And as Jason says, to get to a point where everybody then can start qualification more quickly if they're not part of that really fast stream. So you can't really look at this approach without looking at the other approach and thinking, and give us some thoughts on each of them, and the kind of pros and cons through the consultation responses would be very helpful to us, because we want to know where the appetite is for doing things in these different ways. And that's why I say in round two, we are progressing the plan, but there are still quite fundamental questions on approach. And if we don't get feedback this time that gives us really good, information on what you believe is the right thing, we're going to have to make some decisions about this plan. We're going to have to start telling you what we think is the approach. So this is a consultation, but the consultation is give us the information so that we don't end up having to make decisions about the plan in isolation, which was what we tried to avoid in the whole process so far.
Another thought, Keith, whilst you mentioned incentives as well, the other implication, Chris, which I'm sure you can see in the plan, is if you are a SIT participant, even if you're in the sort of later batch of SIT participants, you do have the opportunity to start migration earlier, and you do have the opportunity to take longer for migration and to start to bring customers into the MHHS arrangements earlier. I know it's a bit of a statement of the bleeding obvious, but whilst we're talking about incentives, the assumption that underpins it is that we do have reverse migration in place, and therefore there is the opportunity to migrate early and gain the benefits of early migration.
Yeah. And it would also be helpful in the responses to say, well, if you are up for SIT, if you are thinking that you would like to be involved at this stage, then based on which approach, because we've shown you two different approaches here, it'd be good to understand that you would like to be involved in SIT, and your preference on approach is this one or that one, and why that's the case, why you prefer this approach, and why you don't prefer that approach. Because again, giving us evidence on the negatives is just as important as it is on the positives, so that we can understand the whole picture that you're kind of drawing out in your own minds. Okay, right. So what other questions have we got? Graham, you might have to prime the pump a bit. I'm sure you've been speaking with your constituents and you have some views.
Yeah.
Your hands up at the moment. So
yeah, Keith, on that point about reverse migration that you mentioned then, and that planning assumption, obviously one of the things we talked about very briefly, the note I dropped you the other day, was just on an initial conversation we had after the publication of R2 last week, just in order to hopefully give you some high level feedback ahead of today.
yes.
I think there's one of the points there was around the discussion around how their reverse migration discussion is having. I've seen the latest update in the clock. And again, I think I can't remember one of the colleagues on the call sort of came out of that situation. It felt a little bit not quite as positive and as clear cut, should we say, in terms of perhaps the complexity of delivering that versus within this plan. So just to maybe chew around that a little bit might be really helpful.
Yeah, I think so. And I know that Jason and Kate have been involved in migration working group, and we've all been involved in discussions with Ofgem about what is essentially a change to the kind of the arrangements and the design if we were to instigate reverse migration. But I think what I say at the top level would be that the general direction of travel is towards using that as the baseline approach, because it does give us these options to move more quickly and to have a better chance to achieve 2025, which is obviously still the test that Ofgem, or the challenge that Ofgem have laid out to all of us, including ourselves. And also, I think at the top level, my understanding is that whilst we felt that the amount of work in if you like, articulating and designing those elements might have been significant, it's much less so than we thought was the case. It would obviously affect the testing activity more, and there'll be a lot more testing to do. But in terms of actually getting the design done, we believe that apart from one or two parties that we are aware of, it's generally not hugely impactful on other participants. That's our assumption at this stage, based on the conversations we've had. But I know that Jason and Kate have been more in the detail of this than myself.
Do you want me to pick up, Kate? Because we've run through the processes at the migration working group, Graham. So it's important to establish the baseline for the migration process, and then assess the increment that would be required for reverse migration. So that's the first thing that we've tried to clarify and get across in the migration working group. And then this consultation is the opportunity for all parties to provide us with the feedback as to whether it is a practical timetable, given the assumption of reverse migration. So we've been having some bilateral discussions with the DNOs and St Clements around the impact on registration, particularly because that was highlighted to us. Also with the IDNOs and CNC, with some of the impact around unmetered supplies, duos billing, etc. And we have been in dialogue with the agents around the impact of some of the new data flows that have been highlighted in that as well. And I think we'd welcome any feedback from the supplier community. But the key thing is this is the assumption that underpins the plan. And if there are any views on the suitability or otherwise of the timelines we've got in here on the basis of that reverse migration approach, we need to hear about them in the response back to the consultation. And that's why we've explicitly asked for that in the clock as well, Graham. I did add that bit into the comms because I wanted to make sure we were highlighting the importance of the consultation responses for reverse migration. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Kate. I know the last sort of discussion was while you were away. So
yeah, I've got some catching up to do.
Yeah. So we have had those discussions.
Okay, thanks, Jason. So I was just going off mute. I was just trying to also just flip across to that high level email that we sent across. See if there's anything. I think a lot of that, Keith, looking at it at high level, has probably been covered either through your sort of preamble at the start of the session, which perhaps provided a bit more thinking or what we've gone through.
Well, we've discussed the kind of the different SIT paths, and we've actually talked about the different SIT approaches. We have laid out what the challenge timeline is and what it's not. So whether it's possible to deliver that or not, I think I've responded to it in the best way I can at this stage. And as I say, it doesn't have the underpinning planning evidence to support it at this stage, but it's really important as a data point and a challenge point to kind of provoke the right responses. So I think we've probably answered that as best we can. I think the general view, based on what you wrote, Graham, I think your constituents' views in general are that they believe the challenge timeline is not deliverable, and particularly because of the timelines for DBT that are laid out in it. So again, if that's the case, we just need the responses to support those views and articulate them in quantifiable ways that will be helpful to us at this stage. And there's a general point that you felt that this version of the plan might have evolved a bit more. And I kind of would like to kind of explore that. I think I respond to some of those points, but we do think it has progressed and evolved. We do think we've been clear about the migration approach. We have put dates in. I accept that some of the dependencies need to be clearer as we go through this round and into the next iteration of the plan. So that does need to evolve a bit more. And as I think we've all said that the qualification element does need to evolve a bit more, but we have stated assumptions about it, and we are dependent upon code bodies who have to manage elements of this plan. But it would be interesting to know what the code bodies themselves respond in the way of consultation to this exercise, because it's important to get their views on these timelines, but we are engaging with them bilaterally as well. The critical path to this, of course, is central systems, central capabilities that have to be there. And the focus we have at the moment is ensuring that those central parties will be ready when they'll be ready, because that obviously is a clear influence on when SIT can start at this stage, and that's important. I'm just looking at the other points that you've made. I think we probably have covered them. I'm
conscious, Keith, also that obviously we had that conversation perhaps before everybody had the opportunity to read every line and every letter within the stuff that came out on R2. So it might be we've got sort of 6 or 7 minutes left. Is anybody else on the call that has got anything else?
I was just going to ask you about the general statement that constituents may struggle with evidence provision. So can we just talk about that? Because this whole thing's going to fall down without evidence provision. As you know, it's been very clearly laid out by our sponsor and by ourselves that evidence will be required. We've tried to be helpful in providing some guidance on the types of evidence that might help us. But if the view, generally speaking, across the constituencies that you're going to struggle with evidence provision, that's going to be a big problem, and I'm wondering, how that problem is being addressed by your constituents in order to give us the best, outcome of round 2.
Yeah, I don't know. I said whether parties thinking have developed a little bit over the last sort of 5 or 6 days since we had that initial conversation, and always difficult in these situations because obviously we're all competitors as well. If anybody wanted to flag up anything while we've got Keith and co on the call around that, or whether that's something you wanted to sort of feedback through me individually and confidentially. But if anybody, I say it's good opportunity, Keith. Anybody wants to flag any concerns on that?
Or otherwise, Graham, if you're not completely current with your constituents, I did offer you the opportunity that you and I can have a conversation offline once you've had updates from your constituents. I'd like to kind of generally understand the likely kind of strength of responses and evidence supporting responses that we're likely to see at the end of next week. It's really important to us to kind of better judge where things are coming at us from and what the likely level of response is going to be. So if the email you wrote me 2 days ago isn't current, then I think we should have that conversation sooner rather than later, so we can judge that point. But yeah, if there are things that people are comfortable saying in this session, it would be also helpful, because we need to understand where we're likely to be at the end of next week. Is there anything more we can do to help other than what we've done so far in supporting your evidence provision? Chris?
I mean, my outlook is the evidence provision from a qualification and migration point of view is going to be really hard to deliver. Migration wise, we haven't got a design that we can put our estimates against, which causes problems for DBT, but also for the migration timelines as well. And then the qualification would be the same. We don't have an understanding of the structure that's going to be there, the amount of testing that we're going to do, and I guess to Neil's point earlier, what the assumption is on how long that qualification is going to take in a world where everybody's qualifying over a 12-month period. So I think those 2 areas are definitely the 2 where I think evidence is going to be lacking, because we don't have the necessary outlook to anchor that evidence.
Well, except that the evidence you can provide us is what you ideally would be the way in which you would like it to work for you. So if there are assumptions or approaches that you prefer that would allow you to go faster, then that's the kind of, the thinking and the logic that you're building into your assumptions and your plans would be helpful, because that in the absence of what you believe is really granular detail on our side, you could tell us how you prefer it to work based on the way that you operate. So give us a view of your plan or your planning approach that would be ideal for you, and that would help us as well. So I think that that's at least it's not that you can't provide us with anything. I think it's more to do with your preferred way forward will be this. This is the basis upon which you're planning, and what we've said to you doesn't conflict with that, but because it may be that you don't have enough detail from us in those specifics. So it would tease out key questions. For example, your assumptions or your approach that you outlined to us in your response might create potential issues for us that we can then surface and then deal with at that point. So, I'm more than happy to be challenged on the basis that you have a different idea, and that's your preferred way through.
On migration, we do have the process maps published for migration now, Chris. So I think you've seen them in the migration working group. So that should give you a design-based view on what the baseline process looks like and what the potential impact of reverse migration looks like.
And importantly, we want to know how long migration will take. You need to tell us how long, why it's going to take. That's really, that is up. We've had feedback anecdotally that some parties think migration will take much longer. Well, tell us why. Tell us how long. Give us the evidence to support that. It's really important because it's on the critical path, and so on. So there's a lot of information that you can give us. Ideally, plans and the assumptions and approaches your plans are based on would be useful at this stage.
So
Sorry.
Just one thing, just before we close, that we talked about, and I don't know whether it was actually put out in the pack, Keith, was that the reverse migration, if it comes in, which we're seriously looking at the moment, obviously, that we would not expect that necessarily to be developed for the beginning of SIT, that it would be something that, because we wouldn't test it right at the beginning of SIT, it would be something that you could deliver into SIT if you were doing SIT, and then you could drop that in later as an update. So what we were just trying to do there is remove it from the critical path, remove, the unknowns from the critical path, if you like. Yeah. So obviously, you guys need to estimate it, but it shouldn't impact the overall timeline for this.
That's our assumption, yeah.
We have been talking to St Clements, for example, as to whether they bring a drop in for the start of SIT and a second release partway through SIT to cover the migration elements. So and we have talked about that in the migration working group as well. And that sort of applies across the board as per Kate's point there.
Okay, well, we've timed out. Graham, the offer's open if you'd like to have a conversation with me over the next day or two and catch up. That would be, if you'll find it helpful. But we are keen to support you through the next few days to provide for you to provide the right information. So either contact the PMO mailbox or tell Graham, and he and I can speak.
That's fine, Chris. Thanks for that. I'll recycle back round with my constituents, and we'll have a catch-up call, and let's have a conversation at some point, Keith. It may be that we're just reiterating some of the stuff, maybe, and nothing new, but there might be some other nuggets that have come out of today's conversation that have triggered some thoughts that we can feedback. So that's great. Thanks for your time.
It's good to talk. Thank you. Thanks for turning up. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Catch you later. Cheers all.
Bye.
Bye.